Okay, well, welcome to this webinar on privileged access management. I'm Shelley Hill, a consultant at Identity Experts, and joining us today we have Colin Duffy, SVP for our partner Hitachi ID. Hi, Colin.
Hey, good afternoon. How you doing?
If you Good. Thank you for joining us. And now, if you have any questions during the webinar, please send them to the chat window, the question window there, and we'll answer them at the end. This session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you afterwards. So today we are going to be talking about privileged access management, why it is important, and best practice for when it comes to managing privileged access and the features of Hitachi PAM. But first of all, let's start with what is privileged access management. Now, accounts with privileged access are those with elevated access and permissions. So in a lot of organizations, you'll find that privileged roles are being used for everyday administrative activities, as well as high privileged tasks, like checking email with the same account that can update group membership in AD, for example. Now, these accounts are more vulnerable to attack due to their elevated status. So privileged access management is about securing these accounts and therefore securing your environment to sensitive data by segregating the roles of admin tasks and enhancing that authentication process. Okay, so Gartner's top security priority for 2018 access management. Now, that's not surprising considering that 72% of major cloud service tenants have been targeted at least once. Now, organizations represent an information-rich environment for hackers with your servers, your laptops, and your mobile devices. There's a wealth of information to protect. And so with PAM, we can isolate the use of privileged accounts to reduce the risk of credentials being stolen that could expose that data. Now, I'm going to hand over to Colin, who is going to tell us about privileged access challenges.
Excellent. Thank you, Shelley. So just skipping forward here. Oops. Sorry, bear with me a second. So just starting off kind of where the problem comes from, if you will. A lot of times organizations are kind of dealing with a disparity or discrepancy between the number of admins versus the number of systems, devices, things that they need to administer. So there's a proliferation of credentials in terms of admin access that make it very difficult to manage with a small number of administrators, if you will. So organizations tend to choose kind of insecure practices in terms of managing these credentials where they're stored in things like a spreadsheet. Perhaps even that spreadsheet is printed off and put in a physical vault. And those passwords tend to be static and don't change. So you run into challenges both from the perspective of managing these credentials, but also vulnerabilities from the perspective of people leaving your organization with knowledge of those credentials. So that is kind of typically one of the reasons why organizations are evaluating what to do about privileged access. The next area that tends to lead to organizations taking a closer look at this is from an audit and compliance standpoint. When you try to understand who did what with an administrative privileged account, it becomes very difficult because these are generic accounts. They're super user, they're root, they're admin, and they're shared. So you can look at the logs all you like, but all you're going to see is that an administrative user accessed the system at 3 a.m. in the morning last night and did something damaging, and it's very difficult to point to who was that particular person at the time. So another driver behind privileged admin access management is audit and accountability. And the other side of it is also removing the need or the current state, which is persistent access, and shifting to more of a just-in-time access model, where your administrative users no longer should be using these credentials daily or maintaining access to these credentials permanently. You need to shift to a model where they need to come to you or to a privileged access system and get this access on an as-needed basis, therefore increasing your ability to log and audit that access, but also ensuring that the password itself is not shared and kept in a static state. So improving how this access is granted and given out is another driver. And there's many ways you can kind of disclose that access. Obviously, you want to move away from a scenario where you're giving the user the plain text password. That is really not scalable, not sustainable in terms of security or accountability either. So transitioning to a model where your administrators are not able to see the password, but still able to gain access into the administrative account is more of a desired state for a lot of organizations who are moving down this path. They want to improve security, improve accountability, but also not impact the end user in terms of their experience with the administrative credentials. And then just from an order of magnitude and scale, I mentioned on the start that there's typically a discrepancy between the number of administrators versus the number of IT systems, databases, applications, network devices. So you need to look at this more from a less of a manual process and more of an automated process in terms of discovering, identifying, onboarding systems into a privileged access management system, and being able to regularly maintain that rather than relying on humans in terms of availability, or just prone to error in terms of making mistakes around credentials or password changes and things of that nature. So I'm just trying to advance the slide here. It seems stuck. There we go. Let me go back one, sorry. So from a perspective of moving to a privileged access management system, I mean, in simple terms, you're putting all your eggs in one basket, potentially. So, anytime you do that, you want to make sure that basket is available as possible. And you want to make sure that that basket is available in multiple locations at the same time in the event a location has an outage or an issue. Looking at kind of disaster recovery scenarios, there's really no value of putting a second basket or a third basket in terms of your credentials in the same location. There's redundancy locally, but in the event you have a power outage, you're not able to recover because your privileged access management system is also gone. So looking at this from a geographically distributed model is certainly advantageous, whether that's within your own corporate network or deferring to a cloud option in terms of a backup. But something that is certainly paramount is this data set always needs to be available in order for your business to succeed. And then the other side of the coin in privileged access is non-human accounts. So a lot of times this doesn't get the same attention, at least initially, but it's certainly as important in terms of security. And when we see non-human accounts, we're talking about service accounts. So Windows services that are running typically require knowledge of the credential for the account it's tied to, and that account, if it's a privileged account, they need to know, the service needs to know the password, and then also the application credentials. They're typically stored within an application, hard-coded, and sometimes in plain text. So there's another point of vulnerability there in terms of protecting credentials within the application layer that privileged access management systems can help with. So typically customers will gravitate to that over time in terms of their privileged access program, starting with human accounts, admin, root, super user, and moving to non-human accounts. And then, lastly, but certainly not least, is strong authentication. So without a privileged access management system, authentication is really in question in terms of how are you properly identifying and authenticating your administrators before you're granting them access, if at all. Once you move to a privileged access program, you're going to need to introduce strong authentication. and that strong authentication needs to be flexible, it needs to be contextual, so you can authenticate different types of users at different times of day from different organizations, depending on where they're coming from, in order to grant them access to privileged credentials. So that's certainly another step in terms of securing your environment in a privileged context. So those are a lot of the challenges customers are facing and looking to address with respect to a privileged access program. At this point, I'll jump in and talk more about the Privileged Access Manager tool itself. So typically when it comes to a privileged access management project, for example, you're really going to start with getting the systems into the privileged access management tool. Regardless of product, you're going to look at onboarding those systems from your environment into a privileged access management system. And there's several ways you can do that. You can do it manually, which is not advisable in terms of scale, but certainly supported. You can do that through automation, which is targeting various different systems of record in order to identify the various different IT systems that you have in scope for your privileged access management program, and then probing those systems for different types of administrative accounts that you care about and you want to take under management, and then applying policy and rules to how those will be managed going forward. So certainly automation is of value in large environments, but also in large environments that are predictable. Automation isn't necessarily a smoking gun. It's certainly a part of the puzzle in terms of onboarding, but in our experience, we've also seen manual administration still be needed or necessary. And this is kind of a combination of A, automation doesn't solve the entire equation, and B, this gets political very quickly. So if you can, bear with me here, if you imagine shifting to a centralized privileged access management model, whereas before people had the rights to do whatever they wanted whenever they needed, and accountability and audit wasn't necessarily a big concern. Security wasn't as big of a concern as it was, and now things have changed. Those people are not necessarily going to be comfortable handing over the keys to the kingdom or giving away that access back to the organization. So you tend to have to tread carefully. And one of the ways we can support that is, in addition to automated discovery, we can augment that with a delegated model, whereas you can create teams within the product, and those teams have certain rights for certain systems in terms of onboarding those IT systems or applications into the product manually through this delegated model, and having various different roles within the teams in terms of managing the accounts, changing the passwords, or setting them for automation. So we tend to see that when we get into implementing the product, it's a combination of automation for the stuff that's very predictable, and this team delegated model to kind of cover off A, stuff that's not as predictable, but B, also appease a lot of stakeholders in terms of giving them the power to contribute the credentials or upload the credentials at their time or pace whenever they need to. So that's something that we've kind of learned over the years deploying privileged access management solutions. The next step is actually, how do we connect to those endpoints? And an endpoint can be infrastructure, servers, storage, databases, networking devices, as well as laptops and workstations. So both are really in play in terms of a privileged access management program, and being able to navigate across isolated network segments is important, but also being able to support scenarios where a laptop might be powered off and might move around behind different firewalls. So there's two features at play here. There's our connectors talking to the managed endpoints that are always on static. We know where they are. That's typically the infrastructure. And then we have an agent or client that sits on the workstation that calls home when needed and says, I'm available, please randomize my password and update my credential effectively. So that's two ways to support it in terms of managing two types of infrastructure, if you will. Once we've kind of discovered the systems, we've onboarded the systems, we're randomizing the credentials. Now nobody knows what those passwords are. They no longer have that admin access on a day-to-day basis. They need to come and get it from the privileged access management system. So typically they will identify into the product through the web UI, and we can leverage existing directories in terms of identifying users, and then we can strengthen the authentication mechanism in terms of who can access this environment. So it could be a multi-factor process in terms of passwords, tokens, and other factors that may exist for customers. We include our own soft token with our software, and then we can make this completely contextual in terms of time of day, type of user, is it an internal user, is it a vendor? Those types of things all come into play in terms of how does somebody gain access to the privileged access management system. And ultimately, this is all available from a logging auditing standpoint. So once we've properly identified and properly authenticated the user, we then move down to, okay, what access can they actually have within the system? And this is all defined by policy and rules within the product, but we support two constructs. There's the pre-authorized access, and then there's the one-time kind of request workflow-driven access, which can tie right back into your ticketing system, ITSM sort of system like ServiceNow or something like that nature. So it's important to understand that you can grant pre-authorized access for systems that a user should have access to based on group membership and other attributes. However, anything outside of that will have to go through a workflow process, and at that point, invite the appropriate people for approval and support things like multiple authorizations, reminders, escalation, delegation. And then lastly, you can control how many people can have this access at one time in terms of a Windows server or an admin account or something of that nature. You can limit it to how many people will actually be able to use that credential at the same time in terms of concurrency control. So I'm slowly progressing through the whole kind of experience from a customer standpoint. But now that I have been authorized to access a system, now comes the disclosure of the credential. So we recommend, as much as possible, leverage single sign-on. Do not disclose the password on the screen if you can avoid it. Now, there's going to be scenarios where you may need to disclose the password, or you might need to leverage the copy buffer. But when possible, leverage single sign-on and launch RDP, launch SSH or vSphere or SQL Studio or any other protocol in order to connect the user to the end system in question. Alternatively, we can also look at temporary elevating a user's access rights in terms of group membership, promotion, demotion, and same thing goes for SSH trust in terms of attaching the appropriate authorized keys file to the user's SSH profile for a time-limited period. So putting them in and out of the appropriate groups and entitlements, and then copying it to the copy buffer and displaying it on the screen. So it's flexible. We recommend single sign-on from a security standpoint as much as possible. And then another best practice is to leverage session recording, session monitoring. So if you need to go into that forensic audit space, which tends to happen in highly regulated environments like finance and potentially healthcare and other places like that, we can support that in terms of capturing the session, video recording, capturing the session data itself. And we can do that on the user's endpoint where they're launching the session from. And we can also tie into the endpoint itself where this session lives, if you will, in terms of capturing what's going on the infrastructure side of the fence. So we can capture both perspectives in terms of the session recording, and that's completely searchable after the fact. So you can search for activity that happened, and you can produce the results of all the different sessions that had that type of activity, and then you can kind of play those back and skip forward to the point in question in terms of reviewing that activity. And then we kind of move past the human accounts where a user logs in and checks out access to something that's more non-human, autonomous happening in the background. And things like of that nature are Windows service accounts. So in order to be able to manage service accounts, there is quite a bit of infrastructure on our side that comes to the table in terms of discovery and being able to identify the various different services and the dependencies they have, whitelisting accounts, being able to understand how do we need to restart a service in order for it to continue to work with us. We don't want to break the service. So there's a number of things to factor into the equation when it comes to managing service accounts. And also from an application to application perspective, we introduce an API call where the application in question can call the privileged access management system and check out the credential it needs in order to go and run. And that whole API call supports the caching of that credential for that application for a time limited period. So it does not need to continually call back to us. It can continue to run with that new password. And then after a certain amount of time, it would call back to us. That whole call, API call, is secured as well by introducing an OTP, a one-time PIN or password we give to the application, so that when it does call back into us, we can more strongly identify and authenticate it, and to ensure that it's not somebody trying to impersonate the application. So that's how we manage the application to application credential problem as well within the same product. And then I mentioned the kind of importance and emphasis on availability. So when it comes to privileged access management systems, you need to ensure that in the event of a local disaster, you don't create a kind of a broader problem, in the sense that if your privileged access management system is offline locally, you should be able to fall back to another location and leverage the same data set to recover the environments or systems that have just gone down. So we bring to the table an active-active model that is geographically distributed, and we've had customers who have lost entire data centers due to flooding and storms and power outages and things like that, and they've been immediately able to fall back to another replica and recover those systems. So our software, customers typically deploy 3 instances of our software, and we'll separate them across continents. So it's very bandwidth efficient, latency tolerant replication that's happening at our application layer. This is not dependent on Microsoft SQL database replication. We have built our own replication capability within the product to ensure that we're doing updates in real time across instances of the software for this disaster recovery scenario. So we take that very seriously, and we believe a hot standby or a co-located model is not necessarily sufficient, if you will. When it comes to supporting a customer's environment, it's also important to have the ability to target all the different types of systems they have in order to manage the privileged credentials. So we have a very robust connector library. It's about 25 flavors of Unix and things of that nature included within the product. And then we can tie into things like SIM systems for logging and reporting. We can tie into ticketing systems for ticket validation around checkouts of access and stuff like that. So it is quite a mature connector library across various different scenarios with Hitachi ID, the product. So in summary, we're talking about eliminating static and shared credentials, randomizing those credentials so nobody knows what they are, ensuring that it's highly replicated in terms of availability, obviously, and encrypted, and only allowing the right people to gain access to the system when needed to check out privileged admin access and accounts, and enforcing strong authentication and authorization throughout the entire process. So that's Hitachi ID on our perspective on the privileged access management problem and this problem space. I'll turn it back to Shelley now in terms of her kind of best practices, recommendations, and how they can help you going forward.
Thank you for that, Colin. So as you can see here, we've got our top 5 for your organization. First of all, it's multi-factor authentication. We recommend it on any user account with access to sensitive corporate data, and therefore it should always be implemented on any administrator account as well. So if you haven't already, go do that now. That's definitely our #1 recommendation there. Reducing the number of global admins reduces the attack surface area. So it limits the number of accounts with high privileges that need to be closely monitored. So less than 5 is ideal, really. Using limited administrative roles like password administrator or Exchange Online administrator instead of global admin, because it reduces the number of high value, high impact global admin role holders that you have. And then we say replicate your PAM vault to avoid that single point of failure. As Colin was just saying there, that is, you know, high on the list to avoid that. You know, so you have that immediate backup if you require that immediate failover. And lastly, we recommend that you remember to secure your social media accounts. So your Twitter and Facebook accounts that belong to the company need to be managed too. So you don't need to disclose the credentials for these accounts. The staff that need access can be provided access with a single sign-on. So don't forget those. Now, I'm going to talk about next steps. I can see we have at least one question. We'll talk about next steps first, and then we will open the floor. If you're looking at, you know, the identity and security transformation that needs to happen at your organization and you don't know where to start, at Identity Experts, we can provide identity assessments on your current environment and provide a report with short, medium, and long-term recommendations for improving the identity maturity in your organization. So we look at the key areas of the identity journeys, which are automation, user experience, recertification, and privilege access, plus a few more. Now, after we do the assessment on the current environment, we provide that customized roadmap based on risk and priorities. So if you're interested in finding out more about that, do get in touch after this webinar. Now I'd like to open the floor to any questions. I see, Will, have you raised your hand? Do you have a question? Not sure if you want to put your question into the questions panel there. Hang on, I'll just see if I can. I'll see if I can unmute you. Joe, are you able to? Oh, actually, it looks like you might be self-muted. Will, if you'd like to ask a question, more than welcome, or if anybody else would like to. Okay, so what we'll do, if you do have any questions, do feel free to forward them on, and we will answer them for you. If you're interested in finding out more about Hitachi PAM or anything else we've discussed today, please do get in touch with either Colin or myself, and we would be more than happy to help. Thank you for joining us today. I hope that you all got something out of it. Thanks very much, Colin.
Yes, thank you, Shelley.